SEAI highlight in their annual accounts that half of drivers are unfamiliar with electric vehicles and how they work, and while less than a quarter say that they will consider purchasing an electric vehicle for their next purchase. I think it was 6,000 EVs were sold by mid-August last year. 175,000 are projected to be sold by 2025, according to the Department of Transport. So is it your understanding that we're going to sell some 50,000 or 55,000 vehicles per year over the next 3 years?
Well, Deputy, there's 55,000 on the road at the moment in relation to what are there today in relation to the and to get that 175,000. There's roughly 100 to 100, over the last year, 110,000 new cars that have been sold each year. We've doubled in terms of the grant side the numbers of cars that have been grant aided each year. In terms of that figure, and the 55,000, which is where we are now, was actually where that trajectory was going to take us to, the 45,000 by the end of last year, which we hit. So in terms of where the capacity and what we can sell between this year and next year, we believe that there's definitely the potential and definitely the appetite.
55,000 for the next 3 years, yeah.
Well, there's 55,000 already there. So in terms of the next two,
but each year,
there'll be. We see that there's at least a demand for 50,000 cars there this year. Now, the supply chain issues in relation to semiconductor, and also in relation to some of the supply chain coming from Russia or from the Ukraine, and the unfortunate circumstances there, so are constraining some of the supply. But definitely the demand is there, and we're seeing the demand increasing, and that we're on target to hit those numbers, that 175,000.
And then in relation to the targets, the 2030 targets, so between 25 and 2030, I was trying to extrapolate out what would be expected, and I've come to an average of around 169,000 cars per year for those years. Would that be correct?
Well, again, I'm not sure in terms of the average on that, but in relation to getting to the 2030 target, there's a number of factors that are happening, Deputy. One is that the cars are becoming cheaper. Two, the batteries technology is becoming better. There's longer ranges in terms of the cars that are there. So, and also the signal is being given that you won't be able to buy a new petrol or diesel car by 2030. So all of those factors are changing behaviour and actually changing the attitudes. And the survey that you saw back from 2020 has changed dramatically. We've done a lot of work with the dealerships. They're saying that the demand, most demand of people that are coming into the dealerships nowadays
I understand the general points. I'm just trying to get to the specifics in terms of how many EVs will actually be sold, and then I suppose the benefits of those, because if we are to have an average, and we must deal with these on averages over a period of 169,000, to put that in context, at the peak of the Celtic Tiger era, car sales were 180,000 per year. So if we have the targets to reach 169,000 EVs per year at the same time when we're estimating public transport journeys to increase by 15% rather, and then we have all this investment in terms of active travel, and we hear Minister Ryan tell us talk about the 15-minute city and all of that. How, in the first instance, how realistic is it that we would sell 169,000 EV cars for each year for 5 years? And secondly, is that actually environmentally beneficial? Because when there may be public transport options available to those who are who would be in a position to purchase those EVs.
And Deputy, in relation to it, the ambition is obviously in terms of the reduction of our transport emissions. There's roughly 13 million tonnes of that, and half of that is, and a lot of that is in related to private driving. So we want to get people out of the cars and into public transport, as well as change the car stock over to electric vehicles. So again, behaviours and habits will change. We see it fundamentally transitioning between now and 2030. Will everybody need to own a car by 2030? That's another question that we'll be looking at. It's constantly looking at this with Department of Transport. The target in relation to where we are for the electric cars shows that trajectory, we're on the right path. But do we need to get all of these number of electric cars? Is there other ways? That's what we're working on with the Department of Transport to make sure.
So let me ask you this,
in
terms of the targets for electric vehicles within the mix of whatever number are sold. We know the government have set out, I'm not making up these figures, these are to reach the government established targets in relation to electric vehicle sales. But in respect of those targets, do you have then further targets of breakdown in terms of the locations, the urban-rural divide, for example, the demographics in terms of income streams, because you'll know that researchers from Trinity and Queen's have essentially reported that electric vehicles are luxury goods. They favour, and the sales reflect this, they favour those who are actually wealthier and who live in areas where there is actually public transport options, as opposed to those who are poorer and who live in areas where there is no public transport option and who are actually hardest hit by the taxes that are paying for the grants to fund these EVs in the first place. So do you have sub-targets within the overall numbers of EVs that are expected to be sold?
In short answer, Deputy, no, we don't have a breakdown in relation to targets. We just have the national target, and that's what we're working towards, and that's in terms of the, as I said, the trajectory that we're on. And in relation to the cars, again, they're sold right across the board. We, in terms of making sure that any car that has been brought into the stock, we want to see as many of those being electric cars as possible, because they become the second-hand cars and they become the cars that are going into the fleet and work their way right through the fleet. So that's where the grants are focused in relation to making sure that any new cars. So the idea is
that somebody who happens to be wealthy lives across the road from a DART station, they'll get a grant towards a brand new EV this year, and in a couple of years' time they'll sell it to some poor cod down the country who's been paying carbon taxes to pay for the grant in the first place.
Sorry.
Thanks, Deputy. Just a couple of high-level comments here. Electric vehicles they differ from internal combustion engines. They're technology. I'll remind you back to a time where widescreen TV was a luxury good that everyone had in their home, and it wasn't too long ago. Now, a lot of people have widescreen TVs and they're available at a very cheap rate. Electric vehicles, what we've seen improved.
But can I just cut across you for a second? The government didn't give a grant to those people who were in a position to purchase high-end televisions at that time.
No, but the government didn't have a requirement to reduce emissions as a result of that. So from our perspective, what we see by 2025, if we come back to the chamber in 2025, we will be speaking about electric vehicles being internal combustion engines being expensive and electric vehicles being cheaper, because technology is driving it that way. Subject, of course, to what we're seeing at the moment with supply chain issues in the world. We see in SEAI, if we could see retrofit follow electric vehicles, we would be delighted, because everyone is going to be driving an electric vehicle by 2030.
Okay, well, let me ask you this then, just in terms of because we know what's in place at the moment. There is basically a grant for those people who can afford the tens of thousands necessary to buy brand new electric vehicle. The government have given them a grant. Do you see, or have you examined alternative ways of actually reaching the same the same objectives, but in a fair way, such as interest-free loans, for example, or measures that will allow those people who are actually crucified with carbon taxes and who have no public transport options to actually avail of the huge level of exchequer funding that is going into these schemes? And it's outside of their ability to receive at the moment.
What we see is electric vehicles getting to the point where they're cheaper than internal combustion engines very soon in the coming years. And options, if someone wants to buy a certain brand. Electric vehicles have spun everything on its head. There's technology available now through the likes of I won't name brands because I don't want to be promoting any particular brand, but there is vehicles available now that are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And we look at the fall in prices for some types of vehicles in the last number of years on the electric vehicle space in terms of the brands that have come in, and we see that continuing.
Can I just ask one final question, Chair, and I won't come in later on. So in terms of the state fleet, Garda cars, council vehicles, all the statutory bodies, how close are we to moving them to across to EVs? And do you see that improving in the next number of years? And do you see a role for your organisation in that?
Yes, and we have been working, Deputy, with all of the public sector in relation to looking at them transferring their fleet to electric.
Do you know?
I don't have the figure to hand. We can find that out. But again, it's increasing all the time. The Gardaí were one of the first to take on Post, as you saw. Again, looking at a real demonstration of how it can be done in relation to that. Local authorities taking on board electric vehicles. So it's right across the board. They're all taking that on board, and they're all working with us.
Can I just add that I understand there's an action in the Climate Action Plan to push and force state agencies and state bodies to only purchase electric where feasible and possible. And also we've been working with the Office of Government Procurement to ensure that there's easy mechanisms in place for local authorities and that to access centrally procured vehicles.